The boardroom on the 47th floor of Donovan Empire Holdings smelled like mahogany and desperation. Garrett Ashford. Donovan stood at the head of the table, his 6'2" frame casting a shadow across financial projections that would make most men weep with joy. 9 board members sat rigid in their chairs, watching him with the kind of attention usually reserved for cardiac surgeons mid-operation. At the opposite end, Vivian Blackwell smiled like a woman holding 4 aces and a loaded gun. "You orchestrated this entire hostile takeover." His voice cut through the silence with surgical precision. Vivian's smile widened, revealing teeth too white to be anything but capped. Before she could answer, the double doors swung open. Elena Grace Harper walked in carrying a leather briefcase that had seen better decades. Her blonde hair pulled back so tight it could have been a declaration of war. She crossed the room in 4 measured steps, set the briefcase on the table directly in front of Garrett, and looked him dead in the eye. "I have the evidence you need." The moment froze. Vivian's smile cracked at the edges. Nathaniel Charles Donovan half rose from his seat, age spots on his hands suddenly visible as his knuckles went white against the armrests. Garrett felt his pulse spike, that familiar rush of adrenaline that came right before a deal closed or a foundation crumbled. He reached for the briefcase, fingers brushing Elena's for half a heartbeat, and the world stopped turning. 72 hours earlier, the rain came down on Manhattan like God finally got sick of the city's attitude. Garrett stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office watching yellow cabs fight for territory 600 feet below. His reflection stared back at him, dark hair starting to show gray at the temples, despite being only 35, eyes the color of old money and new regrets. Behind him, Elena's fingers flew across her keyboard with the kind of precision that separated the competent from the indispensable. Patterson Energy just sent confirmation on the Chicago Tower. They want the contracts by Friday. Her voice carried that particular flatness she used when exhausted, the one most people missed, but Garrett had learned to decode over 6 months of 80-hour weeks. He turned from the window, studying her profile in the blue glow of dual monitors. She'd lost weight recently. Not the deliberate kind that came from juice cleanses and Soul Cycle, but the slow erosion of someone forgetting meals existed. Dark circles, shadowed eyes that used to spark with something close to amusement when he made particularly demanding requests. "What time is it in your world, Elena?" She glanced up, confusion flickering across features that would have been beautiful if they weren't currently serving as a monument to sleep deprivation. "Sir, you've been here since 6 this morning. It's 9 at night. When exactly do you sleep? I manage." "That's not an answer." She returned to typing, dismissing him with efficiency that would have been insubordinate from anyone else. But Elena Harper was not anyone else. She was the woman who had walked into his office 6 months ago with a resume that showed gaps wider than the Holland Tunnel, wearing a suit from a clearance rack and determination like armor. She'd looked him in the eye without flinching when he asked why he should hire someone with her particular lack of credentials, and said something that still echoed in his mind during quiet moments he couldn't afford to have. "Because I'm not here to impress you. I'm here to make you more successful than you've ever been. And I will." She had. Every prediction she'd made about her capabilities proved conservative. Every deadline met. Every crisis managed. Every impossible standard exceeded. Garrett had gone through 7 assistants in 3 years before her, each one crumbling under expectations that he refused to lower. Elena didn't crumble. She excavated herself down to bedrock and built upward from there, and if the foundation was starting to show cracks, well, that wasn't his problem. Except it was becoming his problem in ways he didn't have language for. "Go home, Elena." She shook her head without looking up. "The Patterson contracts need review. The SEC filing has 3 errors in Section 12. Your mother called about Thanksgiving. You're expected in Connecticut by 4 on Thursday. And someone named Vivian has been calling every hour for the past 6 hours. I've been sending her to voicemail, but she's persistent." Garrett's jaw tightened at the name. Vivian Blackwell, ex-fiancée, current vulture capitalist. Permanent reminder that some mistakes took years to stop bleeding. He'd broken their engagement 7 years ago after discovering she viewed marriage as a hostile takeover with better tax benefits. She'd taken it poorly, meaning she'd smiled at the rehearsal dinner, then systematically attempted to destroy his business relationships for the next 18 months before moving to London and presumably finding new victims. What does she want? Elena finally looked up, and something in her expression made his stomach drop. She didn't say, but she mentioned she's back in New York. Permanently. The rain against the windows suddenly sounded like applause. Garrett moved to his desk, sinking into leather that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and pulled up the SEC filings Elena mentioned. Sure enough, Section 12 had discrepancies that would have gotten them flagged in any serious audit. He corrected them in 4 minutes, sent the revised document to her screen, and watched her scan it with the kind of focus that made him wonder what her life looked like when she wasn't here. She never talked about it. Never mentioned family or friends or hobbies or any of the normal human things that made people three-dimensional. She arrived before him, left after him, and existed in the space between like a particularly efficient ghost. He'd tried asking once early on, and she'd shut him down with polite finality that made it clear work was work. Personal was personal, and never the twain shall meet. Elena. Sir. When's the last time you ate? She blinked the question clearly, requiring translation from a language she'd forgotten. I had coffee this morning. Coffee isn't food. It has calories. So does motor oil. The corner of her mouth twitched almost a smile, and he felt an entirely inappropriate surge of satisfaction at cracking her professional veneer even slightly. Then her computer chimed with an incoming message, and the almost smile vanished like it had never existed. She read whatever appeared on screen, and her already pale complexion went the color of old newspaper. Elena, I need to make a call. She stood abruptly, swayed, caught herself on the desk edge. Garrett was on his feet before conscious thought crossing the space between them in 3 strides. He grabbed her elbow to steady her and felt bone under fabric where there should have been muscle. She pulled away immediately, professional distance slamming back into place like a steel door. I'm fine. You're not. I just stood up too fast. When did you eat last real food, not coffee? She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something flicker behind her eyes that might have been calculation or might have been surrender. Then she picked up her phone, stepped toward the window, and made a call in a voice too low for him to hear. He watched her reflection in the dark glass, watched her free hand curl into a fist against her thigh, watched her shoulders lock with tension that had nothing to do with fatigue. She ended the call after 90 seconds, turned back to face him. Her expression could have been carved from marble. I need to leave early tomorrow. There's a medical appointment I can't reschedule. Done. Take the whole day. That's not necessary. Elena, you look like you're about to collapse. Take the day. Take 2. Take a week if you need it. I don't need a week. I need 4 hours. Her voice carried an edge he'd never heard before, sharp enough to draw blood if he pushed. So he didn't push. He just nodded, watched her gather her things with movements that were starting to show mechanical precision instead of natural grace, and wondered what the hell was happening that she wouldn't tell him. She paused at the door hand on the frame. Mr. Donovan? Garrett. She ignored the correction. If Vivian calls again, don't answer. Whatever she wants, it's not good. Then she was gone, leaving him alone with the rain and the uncomfortable realization that his assistant knew things about his life he'd never told her, and he knew almost nothing about hers. The medical appointment turned out to be a lie, or at least a misdirection. Garrett discovered this the next morning when Elena arrived at 6:15 instead of her usual 6:30, moving with the kind of careful deliberation that suggested pain being managed through sheer stubbornness. She had his espresso ready at 7 on the dot, color-coded files for his 8 o'clock with the Zoning Commission, and a preliminary brief on Patterson Energy that would have taken most people 6 hours to compile. How was the appointment? Fine. That's not an answer. It is if you don't ask follow-up questions. He should have left it alone, should have accepted the boundary she was drawing and focused on the 17 fires currently burning across his business empire. But something in her voice, that particular quality of forced normalcy, made him push. Elena, if you're sick, I'm not sick. I'm managing a chronic condition. There's a difference. What condition? She finally looked up from the files she was organizing, and her expression could have frozen hell's inner circles. With respect, sir, that's none of your business. It is if it affects your work. It doesn't. You almost fainted last night. I stood up too fast. It happens to everyone. Not like that. They stared at each other across the desk, and Garrett felt something shift in the air between them, some unspoken acknowledgement that they'd crossed into territory neither of them had mapped. Elena broke first, returning her attention to the files with dismissive finality. He should have felt victorious. Instead, he felt like he'd just lost something he couldn't name. His 8 o'clock ran long. The Zoning Commission had concerns about environmental impact studies that would take 3 weeks to address, putting the entire Chicago project at risk of missing its window. His 9:30 with potential investors from Dallas went sideways when they asked pointed questions about Donovan Empire's long-term stability given recent market volatility. His 10:45 conference call with the Seattle office devolved into arguments about contractor negotiations that should have been resolved weeks ago. By noon, Garrett wanted to throw his phone through the window and watch it tumble 600 feet into traffic. Elena appeared in his doorway holding a paper bag that smelled like salvation. Lunch. From the Italian place on 43rd. I didn't order lunch. I know. You never do. Which is why you get mean around 1 o'clock. She set the bag on his desk and turned to leave. He caught her wrist without thinking, and they both froze. Her pulse hammered against his fingertips too fast, too irregular. She pulled away slowly, professionally, but not before he saw her pupils dilate with something that wasn't fear, but wasn't comfort either. Thank you. She nodded once and disappeared back to her desk. Garrett opened the bag to find chicken parmesan side salad and a cannoli he definitely hadn't earned. He ate mechanically, reviewing contracts that all started to look identical after the first 100 pages, and tried not to think about how Elena's pulse had felt like a hummingbird trying to escape his hand. The afternoon brought more chaos. Patterson Energy called to push their timeline up by 2 weeks, which meant scrambling every subcontractor in the Midwest. The SEC sent preliminary questions about the Q3 filings that were polite in tone and threatening in subtext. His mother called to remind him about Thanksgiving and asked if he was bringing anyone a question loaded with 15 years of maternal disappointment that he'd failed to provide grandchildren. And Vivian called 6 more times, each voicemail progressively less patient. At 4:30 he told Elena to put her through. Garrett, darling. Vivian's voice slid through the phone like expensive perfume and cheap regret. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes against the headache building behind his temples. What do you want, Vivian? Is that any way to greet an old friend? We were never friends. We were engaged. For 6 months, 7 years ago. What do you want? Silence on the line, the kind that suggested careful calculation. When she spoke again, the honeyed tone had developed an edge. I'm back in New York. I thought we should have dinner, discuss old times, maybe new opportunities. I'm not interested in anything you're offering. You haven't heard what I'm offering, and I don't need to. We're done, Vivian. We've been done for longer than we were ever together. Another pause, longer this time. Through his office window he could see Elena at her desk phone pressed to her ear, dealing with what appeared to be an agitated caller based on her expression. She caught him watching and raised one eyebrow in silent question. He shook his head and returned his attention to Vivian's silence. You've built an impressive empire, Garrett. It would be a shame to see it crumble. Is that a threat? It's an observation. Empires are fragile things. They require careful tending, and sometimes they require protection. I don't need your protection. Everyone needs protection from something. I'll be in touch. She disconnected before he could respond. Garrett set the phone down with more force than necessary and looked up to find Elena standing in his doorway with an expression that suggested she'd heard enough to draw conclusions. That didn't sound good. It wasn't. What did she want? To remind me that she exists, and to threaten me vaguely in a way that gives her plausible deniability if I try to report it. Elena crossed to his desk, set down a folder he hadn't requested, and met his eyes with an intensity that made the air feel thin. Vivian Blackwell is not a woman who makes vague threats. She's a woman who plants landmines and waits for you to step on them. Whatever she's planning, it's already in motion. How do you know that? Because I've been watching her buy Donovan Empire stock for the past 3 months. Small purchases, different shell companies, nothing that triggers SEC alerts individually. But collectively, she now owns approximately 18% of your company. The headache behind Garrett's temples graduated to a full migraine. He pulled up his Bloomberg terminal, ran the searches Elena must have already run, and watched the pattern emerge like a constellation drawing itself across the night sky. 17 separate purchases over 12 weeks, all under the threshold for mandatory disclosure, all perfectly legal, all adding up to a position large enough to cause serious problems if Vivian decided to get creative. Why didn't you tell me this before I only confirmed the pattern yesterday? I was going to brief you this morning, but you were dealing with the zoning commission disaster. 18% isn't controlling interest. No, but 26 is, and you're vulnerable right now. The Patterson deal has you extended. The SEC is circling. If she can convince enough board members that new leadership would provide stability, she can stage a coup. Elena nodded, and Garrett saw something in her expression that looked almost like satisfaction. Not at his predicament, but at being right. At seeing the pattern before he did. At being the one with information that mattered. What do you suggest? Figure out what she really wants. Because she didn't spend the last 3 months accumulating that position just to have dinner and reminisce. Outside the window, the sun was setting early the way it did in November, painting Manhattan in shades of amber and blood. Garrett thought about Vivian's smile at their rehearsal dinner right before she'd tried to ruin him. Thought about Elena's pulse under his fingertips, too fast, too fragile. Thought about empires and how quickly they could fall when you stopped paying attention to the foundations. What time is it? 6:40. Go home, Elena. Sir, that's not a request. She studied him for a moment, and he saw the calculation happening behind her eyes. Then she gathered her things with efficient movements that had started to look robotic and paused at the door. Don't underestimate her. She's smarter than she looks, and she looks pretty damn smart. I know. Do you? Because the last time you underestimated her, she tried to destroy your business relationships for 18 months. What do you think she'll try now that she has actual leverage? The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun that hadn't finished firing. Elena left before he could answer, and Garrett sat alone in his office watching the city light up like a circuit board, wondering what the hell he'd done to deserve an assistant who saw things he missed, and an ex-fiancé who wouldn't stay in the past where she belonged. He worked until midnight, went home to a penthouse that cost $8 million and felt like a mausoleum. Slept 4 hours. Repeated. The crisis hit on Tuesday morning like a drunk driver running a red light. Patterson Energy called at 7:15 to say they were pulling out of the Chicago project entirely. No explanation, no negotiation, just a polite corporate voicemail that translated to, "You're fucked, have a nice day." Garrett spent the next 3 hours on emergency calls with his financial team, trying to figure out how to cover a $200 million gap without triggering margin calls on his other leveraged positions. Elena moved through the chaos like a combat medic in a war zone, triaging disasters, making decisions Garrett didn't have bandwidth to make, keeping the entire operation from imploding through sheer force of competence. By noon, they'd restructured 3 loan agreements and found bridge financing from a Houston firm that asked fewer questions than they should have. By 2 o'clock, Elena looked like she was about to die. Garrett noticed because he'd started watching her the way you watch a structure that's showing stress fractures. She'd gone pale around 11, slightly gray around noon, and now had that particular translucent quality that suggested circulatory systems giving up. She was still typing, still efficient, still handling 5 simultaneous crises with the calm of someone who'd accepted that reality was optional. Elena, stop. She didn't stop. Elena. He crossed to her desk, reached past her to close her laptop with more force than necessary. She looked up at him with eyes that had trouble focusing, and he felt something cold settle in his chest. You need to go to the hospital. I need to finish the SEC filing. The filing can wait. It can't, actually. We have until close of business or we're in violation. Then I'll finish it. You don't know the format. I'll figure it out. Mr. Donovan Garrett. How many times do I have to tell you to call me Garrett? She shook her head, the movement loose in a way that sent warning signals firing through his nervous system. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water bottle, and he noticed three things simultaneously. The bottle was empty. Her desk was spotless in the way that suggested she'd been cleaning compulsively, and there was a prescription bottle tucked into the corner of her drawer that she clearly thought she'd hidden. He reached past her and picked it up. Elena grabbed for it too late, and the sudden movement made her sway like a tree in wind. The label said things that made his blood run cold. Carvedilol lisinopril medications he recognized from when his uncle had heart failure. You have a heart condition. It's managed. Elena, these are serious medications. I'm aware. Does Dr. Sinclair know you're working 80-hour weeks? My cardiologist knows exactly what I'm doing. And she's fine with it. She doesn't get a vote. That's insane. She finally stood, and the movement was so controlled it was obviously costing her everything she had. She pulled the prescription bottle from his hand with fingers that shook, tucked it back into her drawer, and looked at him with an expression that was half defiance and half plea. I need this job, Mr. Donovan. I need it more than I need to be healthy. So unless you're firing me, I'm going to finish the SEC filing, because that's what you pay me to do. I pay you to be my assistant, not to kill yourself. Then stop giving me work that requires me to kill myself. The accusation landed like a slap, particularly because she wasn't wrong. He did give her impossible workloads. He did expect her to manage chaos that would break most people. He did treat her like a machine that ran on coffee and competence instead of a human being with actual limitations. And now she was standing in front of him, trembling with exhaustion and cardiac medication, telling him that dying was preferable to losing this job. Why? The question came out quieter than he intended. Elena closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, something had shifted in her expression. Something that looked like surrender. Because I have $78,000 in medical debt. Because my credit is destroyed. Because I sleep in a studio apartment in the Bronx that costs more than I can afford, and I'm still barely making rent. Because this job working for you is the only thing standing between me and complete financial collapse. So yes, Mr. Donovan, I will work 80-hour weeks. I will skip meals. I will take medication that keeps my heart from giving out and pray it's enough. Because the alternative is worse. The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of her computer and the distant sound of Manhattan traffic. Garrett felt something crack in his chest, some carefully maintained wall between professional and personal, and words started coming out before he could stop them. Double your salary. Effective immediately. Full health coverage, the executive plan, no deductibles, and you're taking 2 weeks off starting now. Elena shook her head. I can't accept that. It's not an offer, it's a correction. I should have done this 6 months ago. Why? Because you feel guilty, because you're worth it. The words hung between them, meaning more things than he'd intended. Elena's eyes widened slightly, and he saw her calculating, running through possibilities and implications with that analytical mind that had made her indispensable. Then her face went from pale to gray to white, and she grabbed the edge of her desk with both hands. Elena. She tried to answer. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Garrett caught her as her knees buckled and the world narrowed to the weight of her in his arms, lighter than she should be, frailer than he'd realized. Her head lolled against his chest, and he felt her heartbeat against his ribs, irregular and too fast a machine throwing rods. Call 911. Now. He didn't know who he was shouting at until 3 of his analysts appeared in the doorway, phones already out. Someone was talking to emergency services. Someone else was clearing space on the floor. Garrett lowered Elena down carefully, her head in his lap, checking her pulse the way his uncle had taught him during those last terrible months. Rapid and thready blood pressure probably bottoming out her skin clammy with shock. Her eyes flickered open, unfocused. The filing. Fuck the filing. You'll be in violation. Elena, shut up. Please just shut up. Her lips curved in something that might have been a smile if it hadn't been so obviously exhausted. Can't. Job description says anticipate needs. You need SEC compliance. Then she closed her eyes, and Garrett felt his entire world tilt on an axis he hadn't known existed. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes later, which felt like 7 years. The paramedics asked questions he tried to answer about medical history. He didn't know. Medications he'd only just discovered, a life she'd kept hidden with such determination that he hadn't even known there was something to see. They loaded her onto a stretcher. Garrett followed without thinking, without grabbing his phone or his jacket or anything except the prescription bottle from her desk. The paramedic tried to tell him only family could ride along. He looked at the young man with an expression that apparently communicated his exact feelings on that restriction, because the kid stepped back and waved him into the ambulance. The ride to Mount Sinai took 12 minutes. Elena stayed unconscious the entire time, hooked to machines that beeped with concerning irregularity. Garrett sat in the jump seat, holding her hand and feeling her pulse under his thumb, too fast, too weak, and wondered when exactly his assistant had become the most important thing in his empire. They wheeled her into the ER at 3:15. A doctor appeared who looked 12 years old and asked Garrett what relation he was to the patient. He opened his mouth to say employer, and what came out instead was, "I'm all she has." The doctor studied him for a moment, then nodded and pulled him into a consultation room that smelled like antiseptic and bad news. A nurse appeared with Elena's chart, and Garrett saw his assistant's life spelled out in medical terminology that might as well have been ancient Greek. "Mr. Donovan, I'm Dr. Margaret Sinclair. I need you to tell me everything you know about Elena Harper's medical history. She has a heart condition. She was taking carvedilol and lisinopril. She works too much and doesn't eat enough, and I should have done something about it 6 months ago." Dr. Sinclair's expression suggested she'd heard similar confessions before and found them equally unhelpful. She pulled up imaging on a computer screen that showed a heart that looked wrong in ways Garrett didn't have education to understand but recognized as dangerous. Elena has hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It's a genetic condition where the heart muscle becomes abnormally thick, making it harder to pump blood. She's been managing it with medication, but based on these scans from 6 months ago, she's been pushing herself far beyond what's safe. 6 months ago, Garrett thought. Right when she started working for him. What happened today? Combination of exhaustion, malnutrition, dehydration, and stress. Her blood pressure dropped, her heart couldn't compensate, and she collapsed. "We've got her stabilized now, but Mr. Donovan, if she continues like this, she's looking at heart failure within 6 months, possibly less." The words hit him like bullets he hadn't seen coming. Heart failure. 6 months. Elena Harper, who was 24 years old and brilliant and stubborn, dying because she'd worked herself to death in his office while he gave her more and more impossible tasks and never once asked if she was okay. What does she need? Rest, primarily. Proper nutrition. Reduced stress. And potentially surgery depending on how her heart responds to treatment. But none of that matters if she doesn't stop the pattern she's in. I'll make sure she stops. Dr. Sinclair looked at him with the kind of professional skepticism that suggested she'd heard similar promises before, usually from people who failed to keep them. "With respect, Mr. Donovan, unless you're planning to chain her to a bed, I don't think you understand who you're dealing with. Elena Harper checked herself out of this hospital 3 weeks ago against medical advice because she said she had work to do. She's not going to stop unless something forces her to. Then I'll be the thing that forces her." Dr. Sinclair's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been approval or might have been pity. She stood gathering the chart and her professional distance. "She's in recovery now. You can see her in about an hour. When she wakes up, she's going to tell you she's fine and try to leave. Don't let her." Garrett spent the hour in a waiting room that had seen too many people receive too much bad news, thinking about empires and what they were built on. He'd always believed his success came from vision and determination, from seeing opportunities others missed and having the courage to pursue them. But sitting in that plastic chair watching CNN with the sound off, he started to understand that maybe his empire was built on something else entirely. It was built on people like Elena grinding themselves down to nothing, sacrificing everything for a paycheck, and maybe the hope that someone would notice, that someone would see them as more than just a function in a machine, that their work, their dedication, their willingness to destroy themselves would matter to someone beyond the quarterly profit margins. His phone buzzed with 17 missed calls and 43 unread messages. He ignored them all. Elena woke up at 5:30. Garrett was sitting beside her hospital bed when her eyes opened, and he watched awareness return in stages. First confusion about the location, then memory of what happened. Then immediate calculation about the damage this had caused to her professional standing. "Mr. Donovan," her voice came out rough, abraded by breathing tubes she must have had earlier. "Garrett." She ignored the correction, same as always. "I'm sorry about the SEC filing." "I don't give a damn about the SEC filing." "You should. We're in violation now. They'll fine the company. It'll show up in the quarterly report." "Elena, you collapsed. You have a serious heart condition. The SEC can send their fines to collections for all I care." She tried to sit up, winced, and fell back against the pillows. Her hand moved to the IV in her arm like she was considering pulling it out through sheer stubbornness. "I need to get back to the office. You need to stay in this bed. I've wasted enough of your time. You haven't wasted anything. You've been keeping my entire operation afloat while apparently dying in the process." "I'm not dying, Doctor. Sinclair says you have 6 months before heart failure if you keep going like this." Elena's expression didn't change, which was somehow worse than if she'd looked surprised or scared. She'd known. Of course she'd known. She'd made a calculated decision that 6 months of employment was worth the risk of heart failure, and she'd committed to it with the same ruthless efficiency she brought to everything else. "Then I have 6 months to figure something else out." The casual way she said it, like she was discussing weekend plans instead of her own mortality, made Garrett want to put his fist through the wall. Instead, he leaned forward close enough that she couldn't avoid his eyes. "I'm doubling your salary. I'm covering all your medical expenses. And you're taking a month off fully paid. Not negotiable. I can't accept that. It's not charity. It's what you should have been paid from the beginning." "Why would you do that?" "Because you're the best assistant I've ever had, and I have no intention of letting you die." Elena studied him for a long moment, and he saw something shift in her expression. Some carefully maintained wall crumbling at the edges. "My real name is Elena Harper. Thomas Harper's daughter." The name hit him like a freight train he should have seen coming. Thomas Harper, the CFO who'd embezzled $40 million 15 years ago. The scandal that had nearly destroyed Donovan Empire when Garrett was 20 years old. The case his father never talked about except to say justice had been served. "Your father was convicted of embezzlement. My father was innocent, and I'm going to prove it." Her voice carried absolute certainty, the kind that came from years of belief calcifying into identity. Garrett felt pieces falling into place, patterns he should have seen earlier if he'd been paying attention to anything except his own empire. "That's why you took this job. You're investigating me. I'm investigating your father. And his accomplice. The woman who actually committed the crime and let my father take the fall. Who." Elena's eyes held his, and he saw 15 years of anger and grief compressed into 2 syllables. "Vivian Blackwell." The machines beeped in the silence that followed. Somewhere down the hall someone was paging a doctor. Outside the window, Manhattan was lighting up for another night of commerce and chaos, and Garrett Ashford Donovan sat beside the hospital bed of a woman who'd infiltrated his company to prove his father was a criminal, feeling his entire world rearrange itself into configurations he didn't have maps for. "I have 6 months before my heart gives out. I'll spend it clearing his name with or without you." The challenge in her voice was clear. She expected him to fire her, probably, to throw her out and close ranks around his father the way families did when threatened. Instead, Garrett pulled out his phone, made a call to his corporate attorney, and said 5 words that would change everything. "I need to investigate my father." He hung up before his lawyer could ask questions. Looked at Elena Harper. This woman who'd worked herself nearly to death for revenge and justice and maybe something else he was only starting to understand. "Tell me everything, and then we're going to figure this out together." The hospital discharged Elena Harper 36 hours later with instructions she ignored before the ink dried on the paperwork. Garrett knew this because he'd stationed his driver outside her Bronx apartment building and received hourly updates that suggested his former assistant had taken medical advice as a personal challenge. She left for the public library at 8 in the morning, returned at 6 in the evening carrying file boxes that required 2 trips from a borrowed shopping cart. Her light stayed on until 3 a.m., visible from the street through curtains too thin to provide actual privacy. He gave her 3 days before showing up at her door with Chinese food and a laptop containing 15 years of archived company emails. "You're supposed to be resting." Elena stood in the doorway wearing sweatpants and a Columbia t-shirt that had seen better decades. Her hair pulled back in a messy knot that made her look younger than 24. Behind her, the studio apartment was exactly what he'd expected. Sparse furniture, stacks of documents covering every flat surface, and a wall covered in photographs and timelines connected by red string like something from a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. "I am resting. Sitting down counts as resting. Dr. Sinclair said reduced stress. This is reducing my stress. Sitting in a hospital bed wondering if my father died, thinking the whole world believed he was a thief, that's stress. This is productive." She stepped back to let him enter, and Garrett cataloged details that told stories she wouldn't. The prescription bottles lined up on the kitchen counter with military precision, the calendar on the wall showing medical appointments color-coded by urgency, the framed photograph of a man who had to be Thomas Harper wearing a suit that suggested better times and a smile that suggested he'd believed the world was fundamentally fair. "Your father looks like a good man. He was the best man. He taught me that integrity matters more than success, that doing the right thing is worth the cost." Elena crossed to the wall of evidence, trailing fingers across photographs that chronicled her father's fall from CFO to convict to corpse. Garrett recognized some of the images from news coverage he'd seen at 22, young to understand the implications and too wrapped up in his own empire building to care about casualties. He died in prison. Heart attack. After only 1 year inside, the stress of incarceration and the destroyed reputation killed him. They said it exacerbated a pre-existing condition. She turned to face him, and her expression carried the kind of cold fury that came from grief aged into purpose. "He had no pre-existing condition, until your father and Vivian Blackwell destroyed his life and put him in a cage where his heart gave out. So yes, Mr. Donovan, this is reducing my stress. Because every document I find, every piece of evidence I uncover brings me closer to making them pay for what they did." Garrett set down the food and laptop, moving to the wall to study the timeline she'd constructed. It was meticulous, obsessive, the work of someone who'd spent years assembling fragments into a narrative that made sense of senseless tragedy. He saw his own name appear in several places, always tangential, never central. 20-year-old Garrett attending board meetings. 21-year-old Garrett closing his first major deal. 22-year-old Garrett building an empire while Thomas Harper rotted in prison for crimes he didn't commit. "Show me what you have." For the next 4 hours, Elena walked him through 15 years of investigation conducted in the margins of a life spent surviving. She'd started at 16, stealing her mother's laptop to search court records and SEC filings. By 18, she'd taught herself forensic accounting through YouTube videos and library books. At 20, she'd tracked down 3 former Donovan Empire employees who remembered things that didn't add up. By 22, she'd assembled enough circumstantial evidence to know she was right, and enough legal knowledge to understand that circumstantial wouldn't be sufficient. The wire transfers happened over 18 months. Small amounts. 500,000 here, 700 there, always below the threshold that would trigger automatic flags. The money moved through offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, then to a Swiss bank, then disappeared into what appears to be a series of shell corporations registered in Delaware. How did they pin it on your father-forged authorization signatures? Fake email trails, and testimony from Vivian Blackwell stating she'd witnessed my father making unauthorized transfers. Your father corroborated her story. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Garrett studied the financial records Elena had somehow acquired through methods he suspected were not entirely legal. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it: systematic embezzlement disguised as legitimate transactions covered by paperwork that would have been convincing to anyone not searching for discrepancies. Thomas Harper's digital signature appeared on every fraudulent document, perfect except for metadata timestamps that showed the files had been created after the transactions occurred. This is good work. But it's not enough for exoneration. I know. That's why I needed access to the sealed files. The ones that would show who actually had access to my father's computer, who created those forged documents, who benefited from the money once it disappeared. And you thought infiltrating Donovan Empire would get you that access. It was always a long shot, but I had to try something. My father has been dead for 14 years. My mother killed herself 6 months after he went to prison. I have nothing left except this. She gestured at the wall of evidence, and Garrett saw what it really was, a monument to the dead built by someone who'd sacrificed everything trying to resurrect their memory. Elena Harper had spent her entire adult life chasing justice that might not exist, funding the search with jobs that were destroying her, all while a genetic time bomb ticked in her chest. The laptop I brought has every email sent or received by Donovan Empire executives between 2009 and 2011. It's not technically legal for me to have it, and it's definitely not legal for me to share it, but I'm done protecting my father's reputation at the expense of truth. Why? Garrett's chest tightened as the words came out before he'd fully formed the thought. Because you're right. If your father was innocent, then mine is guilty. And I built everything I have on a foundation he constructed with embezzled money and destroyed lives. That makes me complicit whether I knew it or not. Elena stared at him like he'd started speaking a language she'd studied but never heard spoken aloud. Then she sat down at her laptop, pulled up the files Garrett had brought, and began searching with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she'd forgotten he was there. He watched her work, noting the way her hands trembled slightly, despite medication, the way she pressed her lips together in concentration, the way she existed in this moment with complete disregard for the fact that this investigation might kill her before she got answers. 3 hours into the email archive, Elena found the first real evidence. A message thread between Nathaniel Donovan and Vivian Blackwell discussing offshore account structures dated 6 weeks before the first fraudulent transfer. Nothing explicitly incriminating, but the subtext was clear to anyone looking for it. They were setting up infrastructure for money to disappear. 2 hours after that, she found the smoking gun. An email from Vivian to Nathaniel with the subject line, "Harper problem resolved." The body contained a single sentence. Authorization signatures complete, email trail established. Swiss account confirmed. The timestamp showed it was sent 3 days before Thomas Harper was arrested. Garrett felt something cold and sharp settle in his stomach as he read the message over Elena's shoulder. His father, his blood, the man who'd raised him with lectures about integrity and hard work and building things that lasted. That man had conspired to frame an innocent person, stolen $40 million, and let Thomas Harper die in prison for crimes Nathaniel committed. I need to confront him. Elena turned to face him, and her expression held nothing resembling triumph, just exhaustion and grief and a hollow kind of vindication that came from being right about something you'd hoped you were wrong about. What will you say? I don't know. He'll deny it. They always do. Men like your father don't admit to destroying lives because it requires acknowledging they're capable of destruction. Men like my father Garrett thought and felt the phrase settle into his identity like a diagnosis. He was Nathaniel's son. He'd built his empire using money and connections that came from his father's crimes. Every success he'd claimed as earned might have been purchased with Thomas Harper's blood. His phone buzzed with a message from his attorney. "Call me immediately. Re Blackwell." He stepped into the hallway, dialed, and got 3 sentences that rearranged his understanding of the current crisis. Vivian Blackwell has been accumulating Donovan Empire stock through 17 different shell companies for the past 3 months. She now owns approximately 18% of your company, and she just filed papers announcing her intention to attend next week's board meeting with a proposal to remove Nathaniel from all leadership positions. Garrett ended the call and returned to Elena's apartment, finding her standing at the wall of evidence with her arms wrapped around herself like she was holding something in. She'd added the smoking gun email to the timeline, connected it to her father's arrest with red string, and written a single word above it in block letters: conspiracy. Vivian is making her move. She's planning to take over the company. Good. Elena's voice was flat, empty of inflection. Garrett studied her profile and saw something that worried him more than corporate takeovers or family betrayals. She'd gone still in a way that suggested shock wearing off and rage settling in. Elena. She didn't respond. He moved closer, saw tears tracking down her face with mechanical regularity, and understood that she was crying without seeming to notice she was doing it. 15 years of grief compressing into this single moment when theory became evidence, became undeniable truth. Her father had been innocent. Her mother had killed herself because she couldn't survive the weight of false accusations. Elena herself had inherited a heart condition that would kill her young, wasted years chasing vindication, and sacrificed everything at the altar of justice that should have been automatic. "I want them to lose everything." Her voice emerged barely above a whisper, but it carried the kind of conviction that moved mountains and toppled empires. "The way my father lost everything. The way my mother lost everything. The way I've lost everything. I want Nathaniel to feel what it's like to be convicted of crimes you committed. I want Vivian to understand what it's like when the world believes you're guilty even when you tell the truth. I want them to die the way my father died, alone and afraid, and knowing that nobody remembers the good man they were." Garrett reached for her shoulder, pulled back before making contact. Professional boundaries that had governed their relationship for 6 months suddenly felt inadequate for this moment. Elena turned to face him, and he saw something in her expression that looked like permission or maybe desperation. "Help me destroy them." It wasn't a request. It was an invitation to choose which version of himself he wanted to be. His father's son protecting the empire built on stolen money and murdered reputations, or something else. Something that required burning down everything he'd built to build something better from the ashes. He pulled her into an embrace that was completely inappropriate for an employer and former assistant, and felt her collapse against his chest like a structure that had been holding itself together through pure stubbornness. She shook with sobs that sounded like they were tearing her apart from the inside, and Garrett held on while she broke because it was the only thing he could do that mattered. When she pulled back 10 minutes later, her face was blotchy and her eyes were red, but something in her expression had shifted. Some burden partially shared, some weight distributed across 2 sets of shoulders instead of one. "I'm sorry. That was unprofessional. Elena, we're past professional. Are we?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them had vocabulary for. Garrett thought about her pulse under his fingers in the ambulance, the way his world had tilted when she collapsed, the sick feeling in his chest when Dr. Sinclair said heart failure in 6 months. He thought about how she'd worked herself nearly to death in his office while planning to destroy his family, and how that somehow made her the most honest person he'd ever met. "I think we're something I don't have words for yet, but we're definitely not professional anymore." Elena's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Good. Because I can't keep pretending I don't want to burn your father's world down, and that's definitely not in any assistant handbook. Then let's burn it down together." The plan took shape over 72 hours, fueled by coffee and Chinese food, and a growing awareness that they were either going to succeed spectacularly or destroy each other trying. Garrett pulled corporate records that should have required board approval. Elena hacked into sealed court files using methods that would definitely constitute felonies if anyone found out. Together they built a case that would either exonerate Thomas Harper posthumously or land them both in federal prison. The key was the offshore accounts. Vivian had been clever about hiding the money trail, but she'd made one mistake. She'd accessed the Swiss bank account from her personal computer in 2010, leaving a digital fingerprint that forensic analysis could still detect. Garrett hired the best cybersecurity firm in New York, paying triple their usual rate for absolute discretion and results within 48 hours. They found the fingerprint. They also found something else. Vivian had accessed the same account 3 weeks ago, moving money in preparation for something large, possibly funding her hostile takeover, possibly covering her tracks. Either way, it established a continuous pattern from the original crime to the present day. This proves she did it, but it doesn't prove your father knew. Elena looked up from the laptop where she'd been cross-referencing wire transfers with board meeting minutes, and Garrett saw the conflict in her expression. Part of her wanted Nathaniel to be guilty, needed him to be guilty, required his culpability to make the math of her grief add up correctly. But another part, the part that still believed in things like truth and precision, wouldn't let her take the easy answer if it wasn't the right one. "There's another email. I found it buried in the archive you brought." She pulled it up, a message from Nathaniel to Vivian with the subject line, "Make it clean. The body was a single sentence. If we do this, there can be no trail leading back to us. Harper has to look guilty beyond doubt. That's pretty explicit. Garrett heard his own voice like it belonged to someone else. Clinical. Detached. The voice of a man discussing business strategy instead of his father's decision to destroy an innocent person. Elena closed the laptop and studied him with an expression he couldn't quite read. How do you feel? Honestly, I don't know. Part of me wants to believe there's an explanation, some context that makes this less monstrous than it looks. But the evidence doesn't leave room for that. My father is exactly what this email suggests he is. A criminal. A murderer. Thomas Harper died because of decisions my father made. That makes him responsible for your father's death as surely as if he'd strangled him. The word murderer seemed to echo in the small apartment. Elena flinched like he'd struck her, and Garrett realized she'd never quite articulated it that way. Embezzlement was a white-collar crime antiseptic and removed from physical consequences. But what Nathaniel had done went beyond financial fraud. He'd killed a man slowly through years of incarceration and destroyed reputation and let him die believing the entire world thought he was guilty. I need to confront him before the board meeting. That's a bad idea. If he knows what we've found, he'll destroy evidence, or worse, he'll use his resources to bury us. Then I'll confront him at the board meeting, in front of everyone. Make it impossible for him to hide. Elena shook her head and Garrett saw calculation happening behind her eyes. That's also a bad idea. Vivian will use the chaos to push through her takeover. We need to be smarter than them. We need to turn their plan against them. How? By letting them think they're winning right up until they lose. She pulled out a legal pad and started sketching a strategy that was either brilliant or insane, possibly both. The board meeting was in 5 days. Vivian would arrive with her 18% and a proposal to restructure leadership. She'd have the votes lined up probably through bribes or blackmail or promises she had no intention of keeping. The goal would be installing herself as chairman, marginalizing Nathaniel, and positioning herself to take full control within 6 months. What Elena proposed was letting her do exactly that. Let Vivian walk into the boardroom thinking she'd won. Let her present her proposal. Let the vote happen. And then at the moment when she thought the company was hers, produce evidence that she'd committed securities fraud both 15 years ago and currently making her legally ineligible to hold any corporate position. We'll need the SEC involved. Already contacted them through a whistleblower hotline. They're building a case, but they need time. How much time? 72 hours minimum, which means we have to stall the board meeting. Can't. It's already scheduled. Postponing would tip off Vivian that something's wrong. Then we need the SEC to crash the meeting, show up with federal agents and arrest warrants right in the middle of Vivian's moment of triumph. Elena, that's not how the SEC operates. They don't coordinate dramatic arrests for entertainment value. Maybe not usually, but I bet they would if we could prove she's actively moving money right now. That turns this from historical crime to ongoing criminal enterprise. They spent the next 18 hours tracking Vivian's current financial movements, following digital breadcrumbs through a maze of shell corporations and offshore accounts. What they found suggested she wasn't just taking over Donovan Empire for revenge or profit. She was planning to strip the company's assets, saddle it with debt, and walk away with hundreds of millions while everyone else absorbed the losses. The scale of the scheme was breathtaking. Vivian had spent years positioning herself for this single move, acquiring shell companies, establishing credit lines, building relationships with unscrupulous financiers who didn't ask questions as long as the returns justified the risk. The hostile takeover was just the opening move in a game that would end with Donovan Empire gutted and Vivian Blackwell vanishing into some tax haven with enough money to fund a small nation. This is ambitious even for her. Garrett studied the financial projections Elena had pulled together, feeling something like admiration mixed with revulsion. Vivian had always been brilliant. That's what had attracted him to her initially back when he was 28 and stupid enough to believe brilliance equaled integrity. But somewhere along the way her brilliance had curdled into something predatory. Or maybe it had always been predatory and he'd just been too blind to see it. She's not doing this alone. The capital requirements are too high. She has backers. Can we find them? Not in 5 days. But we don't need to. If we can prove the offshore account activity and connect it to the original embezzlement, the SEC will freeze everything pending investigation. That stops the takeover and gives us time to build the full case. And your father Garrett felt his jaw tighten involuntarily. Nathaniel had called twice in the past 3 days. Left voicemails about the board meeting, about strategy for dealing with Vivian, about family loyalty and protecting the empire they'd built together. Each message made Garrett's skin crawl a little more. My father goes down with her. They committed these crimes together. They should face consequences together. Even if that means losing the company, especially if that means losing the company. I'd rather burn it all down than keep anything built on what they did. Elena studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, some final wall coming down. She crossed the space between them, reached up to touch his face with fingers that trembled slightly from medication and exhaustion, and he felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. You're a better man than your father. That's a low bar. It's not, actually. Most people would protect their family regardless of guilt. Most people would choose empire over integrity. You're choosing the harder thing. I'm choosing you. The words came out before he'd fully processed the thought, but once said, they hung in the air with the weight of undeniable truth. He was choosing her, Elena Harper with her genetic time bomb and her obsessive investigation and her brilliant broken determination to make things right. He was choosing her over his father, over his company, over everything he'd spent 15 years building. Why? Her voice emerged barely above a whisper, like she was afraid the answer might be something she couldn't handle. Garrett pulled her closer, close enough to feel her pulse in her throat, too fast, but steady. Because you make me want to be worthy of you. Because watching you sacrifice everything for truth makes me realize I've been sacrificing truth for everything. Because when you collapsed in my office, I understood that there are things more important than empires. Like what? Like not becoming my father. Like building something that doesn't require anyone else's destruction. Like you. Elena kissed him then, and it was completely inappropriate and absolutely necessary, and tasted like coffee and desperation and promise. When they pulled apart, both breathing harder, she rested her forehead against his chest. If we do this, we can't go back. Everything changes. Good. Everything should change. They spent the next 3 days building the case with obsessive precision. Elena coordinated with the SEC whistleblower division, feeding them evidence in carefully measured doses that would lead investigators to the conclusions she needed them to reach. Garrett worked his network of forensic accountants and cybersecurity experts, paying premium rates for speed and discretion. Together they assembled a prosecution that would make continuing their crimes impossible and escaping consequences unlikely. The night before the board meeting, Elena's apartment looked like a command center preparing for war. Every surface covered in documents, laptops running financial models and evidence timelines, phones charging for the coordination they'd need tomorrow. And through it all, Elena moved with the focused intensity of someone who'd been preparing for this moment her entire adult life. Garrett watched her work and felt fear settle in his chest like ice. She was pushing too hard, running on medication and stubbornness and not enough sleep. Her hands shook when she reached for her coffee. Her face had gone pale in the way that suggested her heart wasn't keeping up with demands her will was making. Doctor, Sinclair's warning echoed in his mind 6 months before heart failure if she didn't stop this pattern. Elena, you need to rest. I'll rest when they're in handcuffs. That's not how cardiac conditions work. She finally looked up from the laptop, and he saw something in her expression that made his chest tight. I know I'm dying, Garrett. I've known since I was 19. The doctors gave me a timeline, then 20 years if I was careful, 10 if I wasn't 5 if I pushed myself. I chose to push myself because 20 years of half-living seemed worse than 5 years of actually accomplishing something. So yes, I'm probably going to die young. But I'm going to die having proven my father was innocent. That's worth it. It's not worth it to me. The confession came out raw, unfiltered by the professional distance they'd maintained for 6 months. Elena's expression shifted surprise, giving way to something softer. I met you 3 months ago. You've spent your entire life on this. How can my opinion possibly matter more than that? Because you're the first person who's looked at me and seen something besides Thomas Harper's daughter. You see Elena, just Elena. And that version of me wants to live even if the other version is willing to die for vindication. Then live. We'll get justice for your father without you sacrificing yourself. How? By being smarter than them. By using the system they corrupted to destroy them. By winning in a way that lets you survive to see it. Elena closed her laptop and moved to where he stood by the window overlooking the Bronx. Outside, the city sprawled in all directions, 8 million people navigating their own disasters and triumphs. She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arms around her, feeling her heartbeat against his ribs, irregular but persistent. Tomorrow we burn it all down. Tomorrow we burn down the parts that deserve burning, and we build something better from what's left. Promise me something. Anything. Promise me that if this doesn't work, if they win, and we lose and everything falls apart, you'll walk away. Don't sacrifice your life trying to salvage mine. Garrett turned her to face him, holding her gaze with an intensity that made the air feel thin. I'm not walking away from you. Not tomorrow. Not ever. We win or lose this together. And then we figure out what comes after together. That's the only promise I can make. Elena kissed him again, and this time it carried less desperation and more certainty. When they pulled apart, she smiled for the first time since he'd shown up at her door with Chinese food and corporate secrets. Okay. Together. They spent the night making final preparations, running through scenarios and contingencies, stress testing every assumption that could break under pressure. At 2 a.m, Garrett forced Elena to lie down for 4 hours of sleep, while he kept watch over evidence that could exonerate a dead man and destroy a living empire. At 6, they reviewed everything one final time. At 7, they showered in shifts and dressed for war, disguised as a board meeting. At 8:15, Garrett's phone rang. The SEC agent he'd been coordinating with a woman named Jennifer Torres, who sounded perpetually exhausted and permanently angry. We have the warrants. Federal agents are standing by. When Vivian Blackwell attempts to assume any corporate position, we'll execute the arrests. Both of them. Both of them. Vivian Blackwell and Nathaniel Donovan. Securities fraud conspiracy, wire fraud, and a couple other charges we're still finalizing. They're looking at 15 to 20 years federal time if convicted. Thank you. Don't thank me. This is the easiest case I've built in 5 years. They left a trail wide enough to drive a truck through. All we needed was someone willing to follow it. Garrett ended the call and looked at Elena, who'd gone very still in the way she did when processing information that rewrote her understanding of reality. Your father. They're arresting your father. I know. Are you okay with that? No. But I'm okay with it being necessary. They drove to Donovan Empire Holdings in Garrett's car, arriving 40 minutes before the board meeting was scheduled to begin. The building looked exactly as it always did, 60 stories of glass and steel and ambition, reaching toward a sky that didn't care about empires or justice or any of the small human dramas playing out in its shadow. Garrett thought about all the times he'd walked through these doors feeling like he owned the world, back when he was too ignorant to understand that ownership was an illusion and empires were just elaborate structures waiting to collapse. Elena reached for his hand as they entered the lobby, and he felt her pulse through her palm, too fast but steady. They rode the elevator to the 47th floor in silence, both knowing that the next 2 hours would determine whether Thomas Harper's name was cleared or whether he died forever guilty of crimes he didn't commit. The boardroom was already filling with members when they arrived. 9 faces that represented decades of business experience and millions in personal wealth. People who'd built their lives on the foundation Nathaniel had constructed with embezzled money and murdered reputations. Some of them might have known. Others were probably innocent, just unfortunate enough to have chosen the wrong empire to invest in. Nathaniel stood at the head of the table looking exactly like what he was, a man preparing for battle. He saw Garrett enter, and something flickered in his expression there and gone too quickly to name. Then his gaze moved to Elena, and Garrett saw recognition dawn with terrible clarity. You brought Thomas Harper's daughter to a board meeting. I brought the woman who's going to prove you framed an innocent man, stole $40 million, and let her father die in prison for your crimes. The silence that followed was absolute. 9 board members frozen in various states of confusion and concern. Nathaniel's face going the color of old snow. And Vivian Blackwell walking through the door at exactly 9 o'clock, taking in the scene with predatory satisfaction. This should be interesting. Vivian Blackwell walked into that boardroom like she owned it, which in 18% terms she almost did. She wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Elena's annual rent and carried a leather portfolio that Garrett recognized as the same one she'd used during their engagement. Some people updated their weapons. Vivian just sharpened the old ones until they could cut through bone. "Garrett, darling. And you've brought a guest. How democratic of you." Her smile could have frozen nitrogen. Elena stepped forward, and Garrett watched her transform into something he'd only seen glimpses of before. Not the exhausted assistant working herself to death, not the grieving daughter hunting vindication. Something else entirely. Something that reminded him why Thomas Harper had been CFO of a major corporation before Nathaniel destroyed him. "Ms. Blackwell, I've been looking forward to meeting you. My name is Elena Harper. Thomas Harper was my father." The boardroom went silent in a way that suggested everyone suddenly understood they were watching something more complicated than a routine corporate takeover. Vivian's smile didn't falter, but Garrett saw her pupils contract slightly. Recognition, calculation. The realization that a variable she hadn't accounted for had just entered her equation. Thomas Harper, the embezzler. "I'm so sorry for your loss. It must be difficult having a father with that kind of legacy." "My father was innocent, and I can prove it." Vivian laughed, the sound like glass breaking in slow motion. "Darling, your father was convicted in federal court. He died in prison after only 1 year, but the damage was done. The case was thoroughly investigated and prosecuted. Reopening old wounds won't change history." Elena pulled out her laptop, connected it to the boardroom display system with movements that suggested she'd practiced this exact scenario 1,000 times. The screen filled with the email Garrett had provided, the one with the subject line, "Harper problem resolved." Authorization signatures, complete email trail established, Swiss account confirmed. This email was sent from your corporate account to Nathaniel Donovan 3 days before my father's arrest. It references authorization signatures and email trails that were used to frame him. Care to explain what problem you were resolving? The silence stretched long enough for doubt to take root. Board members shifted in their seats. Nathaniel stood slowly, his expression cycling through shock and calculation before settling on paternal disappointment aimed at Garrett. "Son, what have you done? What you should have done 15 years ago. Told the truth. You don't understand the context. The company was in crisis. We made difficult decisions. You framed an innocent man and stole $40 million. That's not a difficult decision. That's a crime." Vivian's laugh cut through the tension sharper now, with edges that could draw blood. "This is adorable. Really. Father and son having a moral reckoning while I'm here to conduct actual business. But since we're taking a trip down memory lane, let me clarify something for everyone's benefit." She pulled out her own laptop, fingers flying across keys with practiced efficiency. The display screen split, showing Elena's evidence on one side and financial documents on the other. "Yes, I sent that email. Yes, Nathaniel and I worked together to redirect funds during a period when Donovan Empire was hemorrhaging money due to the financial crisis. And yes, Thomas Harper discovered irregularities and threatened to report them. But here's what Miss Harper's emotional crusade conveniently ignores. Her father had his own offshore accounts, his own shell corporations. He was conducting his own embezzlement in parallel to ours, and we simply provided evidence of his crimes to federal investigators." Elena's face went white, then red. Garrett felt his stomach drop because he'd seen Vivian execute this particular move before. She always had a counter-narrative prepared, always kept evidence in reserve, always made sure that even if she went down, she could drag everyone else with her. That's a lie. "Is it board members?" The documents on screen show Thomas Harper's digital signature on account authorizations for 3 separate offshore entities: Cayman Islands, Switzerland, Luxembourg. Over $50 million moved through these accounts between 2008 and 2010. More than Nathaniel and I ever touched. Garrett studied the documents and they looked legitimate. Perfect forgeries, probably the kind Vivian had spent years perfecting. Or worse, actual records she'd created 15 years ago specifically for this moment, insurance against anyone ever challenging her version of events. Elena pulled up another screen and Garrett recognized the forensic analysis they'd commissioned. Digital fingerprints showing that those documents had been created on Vivian's personal computer, backdated and planted in Thomas Harper's files posthumously. These documents were manufactured. The metadata shows they were created in 2012, 2 years after my father died. You made them as insurance. Vivian's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes that looked like respect or possibly rage. Metadata can be manipulated. Any first-year computer science student knows that. Not this metadata. Not when it's been analyzed by FBI-certified forensic specialists who found your digital fingerprints all over it. Bold accusation from someone who's clearly been conducting illegal hacking operations. How exactly did you obtain sealed corporate records, Miss Harper? Because I'm quite certain you don't have legal authorization to access Donovan Empire's email archives. Garrett stepped forward before Elena could respond because this was his move to make. She accessed them through me. I provided everything as part of an internal investigation into financial irregularities I discovered 6 months ago. Completely legal, completely within my authority as CEO. How convenient. The prodigal son suddenly develops a conscience right when his ex-fiancée attempts a perfectly legal acquisition of company stock. This isn't about justice, darling. This is about you trying to protect your empire by manufacturing a scandal that distracts from your own failures. She turned to address the board members directly, and Garrett watched her deploy the full force of her charisma. Vivian at her best was hypnotic, the kind of speaker who made you believe black was white and theft was prudence. Gentlemen, we're here for a simple purpose. Donovan Empire is failing. The Patterson deal collapsed. The SEC is investigating. The company is hemorrhaging value while Garrett Donovan plays detective with a woman who has obvious ulterior motives. I'm proposing new leadership. Bring in experienced management. Stabilize operations. Protect your investments. That's not a hostile takeover. That's a rescue mission. 3 board members nodded. Garrett felt the room tilting, momentum shifting toward Vivian, despite everything they'd prepared. She was too good at this, too practiced at turning weakness into strength and accusations into opportunities. Elena's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and something in her expression shifted. She looked at Garrett with an intensity that suggested critical information had just arrived, and he gave her the smallest nod. Permission. Trust. Whatever you need to do, do it. Ms. Blackwell, you mentioned my father had his own offshore accounts. Can you tell the board how much money was in those accounts when federal investigators seized them? Vivian hesitated just for a heartbeat, and Garrett knew she'd walked into a trap. The amounts are in the court records. Millions. Exactly as I said. Wrong. The accounts had exactly $0 when seized. Because they never actually held any money. They were shells you created, corporations you established, transactions you fabricated. My father never touched them because he never knew they existed. That's speculation. No, it's forensic accounting. And I can prove it because you made one critical mistake 15 years ago. Elena pulled up another document and Garrett recognized it from their late-night investigation sessions. A wire transfer authorization that showed the actual movement of funds, signed with Thomas Harper's digital signature, but initiated from an IP address that traced back to Vivian's apartment in Tribeca. This transfer moved $2 million on September 15, 2009. The timestamp shows it was executed at 2:30 in the morning. Want to guess where my father was at 2:30 that morning? Vivian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Home, presumably. St. Luke's Hospital, emergency room. My mother was having a panic attack because she couldn't handle the stress of my father's investigation anymore. There are medical records, signed witness statements from attending physicians and security footage showing he was there from midnight until 6 a.m. He couldn't have executed this transfer. But you could. Because you were in your apartment accessing his corporate login credentials, moving money into accounts you'd created in his name. The boardroom erupted in overlapping conversations. Board members pulled out phones, presumably looking up records verifying timelines. Nathaniel had gone the color of old concrete, and Vivian stood frozen, her perfect composure cracking at the edges. "That's circumstantial at best. It's a pattern. And here are 17 more transfers that follow the same pattern. All executed when my father had documented alibis. All initiated from IP addresses that trace to either your apartment or this building. All moving money into offshore accounts that you controlled." Elena advanced through slides showing transfer after transfer, each one meticulously documented with timestamps, IP addresses, and corresponding evidence of Thomas Harper's whereabouts. It was devastating, comprehensive, the kind of prosecution that didn't leave room for reasonable doubt. Garrett watched Vivian's face cycle through calculations, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. This was what Elena had spent 15 years building toward. Not just evidence of innocence, but absolute proof of guilt. Not just clearing her father's name, but destroying everyone who'd conspired to destroy him. Even if everything you're saying is true, and I'm not conceding that it is, the statute of limitations on these crimes has long since expired. You can't prosecute me for 15-year-old allegations. Elena smiled, and Garrett saw her father in that expression. Thomas Harper must have looked exactly like this when he caught accounting discrepancies, that combination of satisfaction and righteous anger. "You're right. I can't prosecute you for crimes committed in 2009, but I can prosecute you for crimes you're committing right now." New slides filled the screen. Wire transfers from the past 3 weeks. Money moving through the same offshore infrastructure Vivian had established 15 years ago. The same Swiss bank account receiving funds. The same pattern of shell corporations hiding the ultimate destination. You've been embezzling from the companies you manage. Skimming fees, diverting funds, using your hedge fund as a personal piggy bank. And you've been doing it with the same accounts you used to frame my father. That's current criminal activity. That's securities fraud. And that's why there are federal agents outside this room waiting for the signal to execute arrest warrants. Vivian's composure shattered completely. She spun toward the door, and Garrett saw her calculate whether she could run, where she could go, how she could escape. But there was nowhere to run. No escape from 15 years of crimes finally catching up to her. "You can't do this. I already did." The boardroom doors opened, and FBI agents entered with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested they'd done this 1,000 times before. Agent Jennifer Torres led the team, holding up a badge and federal warrant with expressions that brooked zero negotiation. "Vivian Blackwell, you're under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and about 15 other charges we'll detail at the federal building. You have the right to remain silent." Vivian looked at Garrett with an expression that contained equal parts fury and betrayal. "You're choosing her over me, over your father, over everything we built. We didn't build anything. You stole everything and called it building." The agents cuffed Vivian with mechanical precision, and she went without resistance, though her eyes never left Garrett's face. He felt no satisfaction watching her led away. Just exhaustion and the hollow certainty that justice, when it finally arrived, never looked the way you imagined it would. Torres turned to Nathaniel, who'd remained frozen throughout Vivian's arrest. "Nathaniel Donovan, you're also under arrest for conspiracy to commit securities fraud and accessory to wire fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "Son, please." Nathaniel's voice cracked on the plea, and Garrett felt something twist in his chest. This was his father, the man who'd taught him to ride a bike, who'd attended his college graduation, who'd called every Sunday for 15 years to check on him. That man was also a criminal who'd destroyed innocent lives to protect his empire. Both things were true simultaneously, and Garrett didn't have framework for reconciling them. "I'm sorry. But you killed Thomas Harper. You don't get to ask me for mercy. I was protecting you. Everything I did was to ensure you had something to inherit. I don't want an inheritance built on murder." The agents cuffed Nathaniel with the same mechanical efficiency. He went quietly, dignity intact even in handcuffs, and Garrett wondered if his father even understood what he'd done wrong. Some people were so practiced at justifying their own actions that they lost the ability to see themselves clearly. When the arrests were complete, and the agents had left the boardroom, held 9 shell-shocked board members, 1 exhausted CEO, and a woman who'd spent 15 years preparing for this moment. Elena stood by the window, watching federal vehicles pull away from the building, and Garrett saw her shoulders shaking with sobs she was trying to contain. He crossed to her, pulled her into an embrace that felt like the only real thing in a room full of corporate theater and collapsed empires. She broke against his chest the way she had in her apartment, grief and vindication and exhaustion pouring out in waves that suggested she'd been holding this in for longer than 15 years. Maybe since the day her father was arrested. Maybe since her mother died. Maybe since she inherited a heart condition that meant she'd die young no matter how carefully she lived. It's over. Her voice emerged muffled against his shirt, and he felt dampness where her tears soaked through expensive cotton. It's over. Your father's name is cleared. The people responsible are in federal custody. You did what you set out to do. Elena pulled back enough to look at him, and her expression contained something that looked like fear. So what happens now? Now we figure out how to live without revenge driving us. One of the board members cleared his throat, and Garrett turned to find Richard Patterson looking at them with an expression Garrett couldn't quite parse. Mr. Donovan, I think I speak for everyone when I say this has been the most unusual board meeting in company history. But given the circumstances, we need to discuss succession planning. With Nathaniel facing criminal charges and the company's stability in question, we need decisive leadership. I'll step down if that's what the board requires. I understand that continuing as CEO while my father faces prosecution could create conflicts of interest. That's not what I'm suggesting. In fact, I'm proposing the opposite. You just demonstrated more integrity than this company has seen in 15 years. You chose truth over comfort. That's the kind of leadership we need. I'm making a motion to confirm Garrett Donovan as permanent CEO with full authority to restructure operations as he sees fit. The vote was unanimous. 9 board members approving Garrett's leadership without hesitation, and he felt the weight of their trust settle on his shoulders like a coat he hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. Elena squeezed his hand, and he saw pride in her expression mixed with something else. Relief, maybe, or recognition that they'd reached the end of one journey and the beginning of something more complicated. The board meeting concluded with discussions of crisis management, public relations strategies, and legal containment that would occupy the next 6 months minimum. By the time everyone filed out, it was nearly noon, and Garrett felt like he'd aged a decade in 3 hours. Elena swayed slightly as they walked to the elevator, and he caught her elbow to steady her. "When's the last time you took your medication this morning?" "All of it." She didn't answer, which was answer enough. Garrett guided her to his office, sat her down in the chair she'd occupied for 6 months, and retrieved water and the pill organizer she'd left in her desk drawer. She took the medication without argument, which suggested she was more exhausted than she wanted to admit. "Dr. Sinclair wants to see you next week. Cardiac evaluation to determine if you're a candidate for surgery." "I can't afford surgery." "Yes, you can. Company insurance covers it completely. And even if it didn't, I'd pay for it myself." "Garrett, you can't just—" "Yes, I can. And I will, because you're right that I built my empire on blood money, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure something good comes from it, starting with making sure you survive long enough to enjoy the vindication you earned." Elena looked at him with tears threatening again, and he realized this might be harder for her than the revenge had been. Accepting help required vulnerability that seeking justice never demanded. She'd spent 15 years being strong enough to stand alone. Learning to lean on someone else would take different kind of courage. What if the surgery doesn't work? Then we'll figure out what comes after. Together. She nodded slowly, and Garrett saw her beginning to believe it might be possible. That maybe she didn't have to die young. That maybe there was a version of her story that didn't end with cardiac failure and posthumous vindication. That maybe, impossibly, she could have both justice and a future. His phone rang. Jennifer Torres, probably calling to update him on the arrest process. He answered on speaker so Elena could hear. "Mr. Donovan wanted to give you a heads up. Vivian Blackwell is cooperating. She's providing detailed testimony about the original embezzlement, the conspiracy to frame Thomas Harper, and about 15 other schemes Nathaniel was running that we didn't even know about. In exchange for reduced sentencing, she's burning your father completely." "How reduced? 8 to 10 years instead of 20. She'll be out by the time she's 42. Your father is looking at the full 20. Garrett felt numbness spreading from his chest outward. 20 years. Nathaniel would be 82 when he got out if he survived that long. More likely he'd die in prison the same way Thomas Harper had, heart giving out under the stress of incarceration and destroyed reputation. Does my father know she's testifying against him? He will shortly. His attorney is being notified now. Mr. Donovan, I should warn you that Nathaniel is going to reach out. He's going to try to use your relationship to influence you. Don't take his calls. Don't visit him. Anything you say can complicate the prosecution. Understood. And Mr. Donovan, for what it's worth, you did the right thing. A lot of people in your position would have protected their father regardless of guilt. You chose differently. That matters. Torres disconnected, and Garrett sat in the silence that followed, processing the reality that his father would die in prison while Vivian walked free in a decade. Elena reached for his hand, and he held on like she was the only solid thing in a world that had gone liquid and uncertain. I'm sorry. Don't be. He earned this. So did Vivian, even if she's getting a lighter sentence. They destroyed lives and they're facing consequences. That's how it should work. Doesn't make it hurt less. No, it doesn't. They sat together in his office, watching Manhattan through floor-to-ceiling windows, and Garrett thought about empires and what they were really built on, not steel and concrete and billion-dollar deals. Those were just the visible parts. Real empires were built on people, on trust and betrayal, sacrifice and selfishness, the million small decisions that accumulated into trajectories no one could fully control. His empire had been built on Thomas Harper's blood. Now he had a chance to rebuild it on something better. Starting with the woman beside him, who'd nearly destroyed herself seeking justice and was only now learning that survival might be possible. 3 weeks later, Elena's cardiac surgery lasted 6 hours. Garrett spent all 6 in the waiting room, and when Dr. Sinclair emerged, looking exhausted but satisfied, he felt something unlock in his chest that had been clenched since the day Elena collapsed in his office. The procedure went well. We removed the excess cardiac muscle without compromising heart function. Her prognosis is excellent. She could live a completely normal lifespan if she takes care of herself. Elena recovered faster than anyone predicted. Within 2 weeks, she was walking miles through Central Park. Within a month, she was cleared for normal activities. And somewhere in that recovery, she started to believe that maybe she had a future worth planning for. The trial came 8 months after the arrests. Garrett attended sentencing alone because Elena said she'd spent enough of her life in courtrooms. Nathaniel received 20 years federal time with no possibility of parole. Vivian received 9 years with possibility of parole in 7. The judge noted that Thomas Harper had died in prison for crimes these defendants actually committed, and that justice, even delayed by 15 years, needed to be served. Nathaniel looked at him before the marshals led him away. "Take care of yourself, son." Garrett nodded but didn't speak because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't be either lie or cruelty. 14 months after the arrests, federal court officially exonerated Thomas Harper posthumously. Elena attended the hearing with Garrett beside her, and when the judge read the decision clearing her father's name, she cried with the kind of relief that suggested a weight she'd carried since childhood had finally lifted. That evening, Garrett proposed in her Bronx apartment where she'd built her case against his father. The ring was simple and the proposal was simpler. Marry me. Be my partner in everything. Help me build something worth building. She stared at him for a long moment before answering. Yes, but I'm keeping my name. Harper Donovan sounds perfect. Just Harper. I earned this name. I'm not giving it up for anyone. Fair enough. Elena Harper it is. They married 3 months later at the courthouse downtown. No elaborate ceremony, no guests who'd attended for spectacle instead of relationship. Just legal paperwork and vows that promised partnership through whatever disasters came next. Dr. Sinclair attended as witness, along with Richard Patterson and 3 others who'd helped them survive the year that destroyed and rebuilt everything. The reception was dinner at the Italian place on 43rd Street where Garrett used to order lunch during those 6 months when Elena worked herself nearly to death in his office. They sat at the same table, but everything was different now. She was healthy. He was free from his father's shadow. They'd burned down an empire and built something better from the ashes. What do you think your father would say about all this? Elena asked the question while cutting into chicken parmesan, and Garrett saw she meant Thomas Harper, not Nathaniel. I think he'd say you did exactly what he would have wanted. Not seeking revenge, seeking truth. And your father would probably say I betrayed everything he built. But he'd be wrong. I didn't betray what he built. I acknowledged what it was built on and chose to build something different. Elena reached across the table for his hand. That's the foundation worth building on. Everything else is just real estate. Outside the window, Manhattan lit up for another night of commerce and chaos. Somewhere in this city, their enemies sat in federal prison learning that brilliant people who chose to be predators eventually faced consequences. But here in this restaurant where their story began, two people who'd survived revenge and cardiac surgery and federal prosecutions were learning that sometimes the greatest victory isn't destroying your enemies. It's surviving them. It's building something that doesn't require anyone else's destruction. It's choosing truth over comfort and integrity over empire and partnership over isolation. Garrett looked at Elena Harper across the table. This woman who'd infiltrated his company to prove his father was a criminal and somehow became the most honest person he'd ever known and understood that everything worth having required sacrifice. The question was, what you sacrificed. His father had sacrificed other people's lives for his empire. Garrett had sacrificed the empire for truth. And Elena had sacrificed 15 years of her life for justice that would never bring her father back, but might prevent the next Thomas Harper from dying in prison for crimes he didn't commit. That was the only kind of empire worth building. The kind that didn't require collateral damage. The kind that made the world incrementally less cruel. The kind that proved integrity wasn't weakness, but the hardest kind of strength. They finished dinner and walked out into the Manhattan night. Hand in hand, two people who'd learned that survival after tragedy wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about integrating loss into identity without letting loss become the only identity. They would always carry their fathers with them, the good man who died wrongly and the guilty man who faced justice too late. Those absences would shape them forever, but they could also be other things. Partners, builders, maybe someday parents who taught their children that doing the right thing was worth the cost. All those futures existed simultaneously with the grief neither canceling the other out. That's what redemption looked like. Not erasing mistakes, not pretending crimes never happened, but choosing to build something better from what remained after justice finally arrived.